Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the RFP Secrets podcast, where we help you make better procurement decisions with fewer regrets. So, for those of you who have been following our show for quite some time, you are maybe familiar with us when we do an interview setup like this. We interview procurement professionals and procurement industry experts to talk about their experience and their point of view about the current RFP or the tender process. But today I wanted to dive into the other side, to the dark side, the vendor side, where I wanted to get the insights from the vendor. How do they react to whatever we do in our procurement world? How do they see the procurement process in terms of efficiency, fairness, the burden for them to respond to an RFP? And I am having one of the suppliers that have recently, and this is how I knew him, and I will introduce him in just a second. I have been helping a state government organization to run a procurement process for an IT system. And we have run the XPD process that we talk about a lot on this show, which is the expertise based project delivery procurement methodology. And I wanted to get his insights about what's different that he has seen in this approach compared to the other maybe tens or hundreds RFPs they see all the time and respond to, and maybe talk a little bit about the challenges they normally face with the current RFP process. So I really have the privilege to welcome Anton Scavello to our show. Anton, really glad to have you on the show. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thank you, John. It's an absolute pleasure, and the entire process of firstly getting to know you throughout that tender, and then of course winning the tender. Thankfully, that was a big weight off our shoulders, and then going into further conversation with you about our feedback on the process was fantastic. So it's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you in more detail
Excellent.
about that from our experience.
Wonderful. All right, maybe before we dive right in the details, Anton, why don't you just take some time, give us a little bit of a background about yourself and your space? And I
Mhm.
talked to you about before we started this recording that you had a little bit of a journey. Give us a little bit of the backstory.
Yeah, I'd love to. So, for those of you who may or may not be aware of the Schiavello Group of companies, it was actually founded by my grandfather back in 1966. And today, my father actually runs the company. It's one of Australia's larger privately owned organizations, and really focuses primarily on the commercial furniture, commercial fit out, and even accommodation offerings. And so today, Scavello is primarily in furniture construction, property development, as well as owning of the assets that they develop as well. And so from my experience personally, I've actually been and had the pleasure of being across a number of those organizations within Scavello. So my career started in fit out and into interior construction. I did that for a number of years, working very closely with designers, with project managers, with the end user in actually building their space. And I was one of the young lackeys back when I first started my career, who was packaging tenders, sending out bids and all sorts of things, estimating, replying to all sorts of outrageous requirements. We did a lot of work for Crown Casino, to just name one organization that had some amazing levels of detail and expectation. And so the construction game was very interesting. It was very fast paced, long days. It was fantastic. A lot of good memories there. I then had the opportunity to move to Singapore, and I actually ran the Scavello furniture business in Southeast Asia for, it was about 5 years. That was a fantastic experience. Firstly, moving out of the country, I managed to rope my then girlfriend, who became my fiance and then wife, to be over there with me, and actually together for some time. We worked together, and Bonnie, my wife, actually helped me quite significantly in building and rebuilding the Scavello business in Southeast Asia. We did a lot of work regionally across Japan, Korea, China, India, Philippines, Indonesia,
Wow.
a little bit in Thailand as well. So we were really moving and grooving in the region. And of course, replying to regional tenders, to local tenders. And we had an incredible experience there, engaging with an entirely different audience. So while I was over there, I actually managed to take over the Scavello furniture marketing team. We rebuilt a significant amount of the communication guidelines, the brand guidelines. We redid websites. We redid quite a significant amount of the Scavello furniture branding. And then I got thrown the responsibility of the product development team as well.
Okay.
And so we redid an entire range of furniture. We launched new furniture, new solutions, technical as well as technology. And that's where actually Neurospace was born. So Neurospace actually came out of the Scavello furniture product development team as a little young idea back in 2017. And as it started to grow little tentacles and legs, it needed a little bit more love. And so at the end of 2019, I had to make that decision to move over full time. And from there, we built an in-house team. So at Neurospace, which is the technology company that I run, is workplace technology. We have all of our in-house software developers, firmware developers, project managers, UI, UX design, customer support, and so on. And that's where we are today, 4.5 years in to being full-time on Neurospace and growing.
I just have one question. How old are you?
Me, I'm 20. No, not anymore. I started my career when I was 19. I moved to Singapore at 21 and I am 33.
Wow, you've done a lot. You've done a lot.
Yeah.
No, well done. Well done.
Yeah. No, I have. When I finished school, I actually started at RMIT studying international business or, international study. And then quite quickly realized that my peers and I weren't on the same trajectory in life. At 20 years old, I actually bought out my first apartment.
Wow.
So I had a mortgage at 20, so I was in a very different place in life. And then I ended up doing study and working in parallel. So a couple of diplomas and certificates later, and yeah, I'm where I am today.
That's fantastic story. And I'm sure we're gonna dive into a little bit deeper into that, but I'm sure that have formed your mindset and in how you actually dealing with them when I'm talking about the procurement and tendering space. These different experiences have maybe shaped the way you think about how do you approach and how do you present your business in the current state within this world of procurement. And we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into that. But moving from there, Anton, I just wanted to ask you, on average per year, how many RFPs do you see, not respond to, but how many do you get
Oh,
introduced to?
wow. Okay. Probably 40 to 50.
Okay.
Um, Depending on the year, I'd say it's ramped up a bit more in the last, say, 18 months. But on average, it'd be, yeah, a good 40, I'd
Okay.
say, 40, 45, of which we'd probably respond to 60% of them.
All right. Okay. The reason why I'm asking this because I'm talking about this point for a long time now that
Mhm.
vendors, when they see an RFP, they don't respond to every single RFP they see, and especially
Mm.
the good vendors. They pick and choose which one they're gonna invest their resources to respond to versus those ones they don't see um, like a fair chance, maybe at least, to
Mhm.
pursue them as an opportunity. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to ask that question because that's really validated or validating what we've been preaching for quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, it is significantly important to understand, and that actually reminds me back probably very early on in my days in Singapore when I was responsible for making these decisions. I was tendering everything. 21, 22 years old, anything I was going for, I was tendering absolutely everything, and we were spending an incredible amount of time, a lot of wasted time chasing opportunities where you were essentially just a price check, which is all too common, especially in that industry. It is exceptionally common to be one of the three tenderers when the organization you're tendering to has already made up their mind.
That's really great insights. Do you mind sharing with us maybe one of the things that you look into when making a
Mm.
decision whether you're gonna pursue this opportunity and respond to that RFP or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's to be honest, it's quite straightforward. If you've received a tender out of absolutely thin air and done no work to get on that tender, then in most cases it's quite unlikely that you have a significant or a genuine opportunity.
Okay.
right? In our line of work, if you don't have a relationship, if you haven't worked for that, then you're not going to, because typically speaking, and I don't want to at all speak ill of anyone in the procurement game, because there's an incredible amount of skill, incredible amount of hard work that goes into procurement. But a lot of the time, procurement has bias in it in the RFP process, and that's understandable because people know people buy from people, people work with people, and then essentially when you're evaluating anything, if you know who's involved, then your natural biases are coming through.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Let's get into it and talk a little bit about your experience with the RFP, the traditional one, and then we're going to talk about your recent experience with our approach. But
Mm.
typically, what do you see is the main challenges that you see in the traditional RFP process? You touched a little bit about the bias. I wanted to understand from you the burden of the amount of resources you have to spend in order to respond to an RFP. And walk me through some of the challenges that you typically see in the majority of RFPs you participated in.
Yeah, I can break down most traditional RFPs into, I guess you could call it two main camps or two main categories. The one is internal and the other is external, right? So you have your internal RFP, which is run by an internal procurement team. And then you have your external, which is typically run by a level of consultant, right? So a project manager or a specialist consultant, like in our space, an IT consultant. And there are differences and different challenges depending on which one of those situations were dealt with. When it comes to the typical consultant RFP, it's very common for us to be incredibly inundated with documents that are irrelevant, right? And to a certain degree, you have to learn how to skim over them. But if you skim over something that's quite important, then your due diligence and the integrity of your submission is harmed.
Mm,
And for me personally, my process is I actually sit down, print everything out, and read it. And I use a highlighter, and I literally highlight all of the important aspects of the submission or of the tender request. And that's very time consuming. As you can imagine, every single one going through potentially up to 60 pages. That was the last one I received, was 60 pages, of which there'd be probably 5 pages that was relevant,
wow.
right? Yeah. But you have to read through it all. So I'd say from a consultant's point of view, RFP point of view, it's copy and paste, change a few things. Obviously, they're trying to get their value or show their value to their customer. And then in the other category, we have the internal procurement team. And the internal procurement team, probably the challenges we often come up with is lack of resourcing, lack of commitment to the tender in a lot of cases or to the RFP. So very light on detail in a lot of cases, which then means that every man and his dog can submit something. You could throw a beautiful Neurospace cap at it and they would accept the tender submission.
You're right.
And so, two absolutely different sides of the coin, and two very different experiences.
Is there one party doing it better than the other?
I'd say typically internal procurement is doing it better.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting insight. I wanted to ask you about the scope of work. And I
Mm.
normally, when we do our presentation, we ask this question quite often. I did ask it like a couple of days ago to a bunch of vendors. In all the RFPs that you've seen, what percent of the time the scope of work that the client have put together is completely accurate?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. And I don't want to answer this because if any of my clients see this, they might get offended. It's probably 30% or even less of the time.
Really? You're
Yeah.
very generous.
Yeah. I'm trying to be very diplomatic in that answer.
Most people, even the client themselves, when we ask procurement people,
Yeah.
I was in an industry briefing yesterday, and I asked a bunch of vendors that question, and it took everyone
Mm.
less than a second to say zero. And we really
Okay.
agree with that. And we've been trying in our research where we came up with this approach, we've researched
Mm.
this deeply, and we found out it's not possible because people's perception is different. So relying on the quality of the scope that you put together and you feel that if the vendor did that will be all right, that's not true.
Mm.
That's not true. And even excluding vendors based on the scope of work you put, it's a dangerous thing to do because who told you that what you've put in place is 100% completely accurate? But people use that as a metric to a lot of the government agencies use that compliance with the spec. But what if your spec is rubbish?
And I mean, a lot of the time it comes down to who you have running these RFPs. If you have someone running that RFP who's quite passionate about telephony and the customer service, for instance, technology space, then you might have a really amazing spec that's written. I feel like, John, my experience with Neurospace, my experience has been maybe a little bit shrouded because we've been fortunate enough to work with some really incredible organizations, and we're supporting some beautiful businesses. And if it's okay to name one of them, I'd definitely be calling out Macquarie Bank, the
Right.
Macquarie Group. The property side of the business is run by a very dedicated and shrewd gentleman called Jeffrey Sloan. And Jeff is the head of property for Macquarie globally. And the process that we went through engaging or being engaged by Macquarie was rigorous. It was very good. I wouldn't say that it was efficient, and I wouldn't say that it was particularly innovative at all.
Mm,
But because they have such significant resources and because they're such expert matters on workplace, they were able to validate, they were able to go into the detail of quite a incredible level when it came to the technology. But I think that's very much an outlier to the overall scheme of things, especially when we're talking about state government, federal government. Unfortunately, they are some of the least successful in the accuracy of their scoping
yeah,
and the levels of detail, especially when it comes to integrations. If we ever get into integrations of technology, they are really not providing any detail at all, and you're making extreme assumptions, and that may even affect your pricing.
that's 100%. All right. Let's shift gears now and talk a
Mhm.
little bit about the XPD process that you went through with this particular organization. And
Mhm.
we're gonna keep talking, referring back to the traditional way, and we're gonna compare stuff
Yep.
together. So just to give a
Mhm.
little bit of context to the audience here, if someone is hearing us for the first time, the XPD process has been really built upon 20 years or 25 years worth of research. And it's basically, in a nutshell, it's a way or an environment where you can attract high performing vendors in the most efficient and most effective way. The process has really two major phases: the selection phase and then the clarification phase. In the selection phase, all vendors will compete. They will submit certain amount of information. They will submit their costing, and there are gonna be a little bit of maybe an interview of key personnel, and then we shortlist and narrow down from phase one to one vendor that gets invited to the clarification phase. And with this one vendor, we do a very detailed pre planning, clarification, do all of our due diligence to make sure that this vendor hasn't missed anything. The award is issued after the clarification phase. So, this is really in a very high level manner. That is what the XPD process is. And Anton, I wanted to start the conversation about this by just maybe asking you, what was your reaction or the first reaction when you saw the RFP document? Because
Shocked.
the way we structure the RFP document is we believe it's quite different from everybody else. In the way we put the documentation, the way we structure the language, the flow of the sections. What was your reaction when you saw the RFP for the first time?
I was shocked. I was honestly quite shocked. It was refreshing, it was personable, and it flowed. It had been put together and I won't forget it because it was a slide document, right? It was, I was clicking through and it was covering everything off. And it almost felt like I was going through the slide deck of a TED talk.
Wow.
That's how it felt like it had been put together. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I actually shared the document with others in at Neurospace to just bring them across, hey, this is how it's done. And going through it, it was clear. There were clarifications, the tasks that were required. There was a lot of information that was provided around expectations, around in a way, controlling the amount of information that was given as well, which is good because if you leave it open, you might get a little bit, you might get a lot, you might get too much, right? Not only does that open opportunities for bias, but it can also, shortcome people who may not provide enough information, even though they have quality information to provide. Yeah, so I'd say I was shocked, to be honest.
Right. All right. Um,
Mm.
so I'm really glad to hear that feedback from you. But what is your overall assessment? And we're gonna dive deeper into different sections of the process.
Mm.
But what did you think of this whole thing?
Yeah, firstly, it was 10 out of 10. And I'm not just saying that, John, because you're here. I told you that even I think it was even before we were fully engaged, actually quite early on in the process. I think I reached out to you and said, "Hey, John, this is amazing. I'm pretty blown away." But I think really bringing the vendor on board with the journey and being quite transparent with and clear. Transparency is one thing, but clear, right? Because the clarity was all you had to do was read the RFP to understand every step and to be essentially fully aligned with the expectations. I'll give you a really good example of a lack of this. One person writes the RFP and another person runs it, right? If one person writes it, another person runs it, the person who runs it actually hasn't written what has been put
Yes.
together, right? And so the person who's running the RFP actually doesn't stick to the details that have been written. And that was definitely not the case here. It felt like whoever wrote it was running it and was going through those steps and was respecting the process. And it was very clear because the dates were respected. If the dates weren't met, there's communication going out. It was just a very tidy experience.
Awesome. One of the techniques that we are implementing in this approach is obviously, and the most controversial way, is the anonymous proposal, the anonymous RFP evaluation. What's your thought on that? So, for those who don't follow what I'm talking about, the proposal that the vendor will submit will have a number of documents that will be completely anonymous. And these are the documents that will only be evaluated by the evaluation team, the technical evaluation team. You might have some other documents that has the vendor information, their ABN, their all of these things. These are not anonymous, but the documents that directly talks to the evaluation criteria, which is going to be evaluated, these have no company name, no product name, no software name, no name that can be used to identify who that vendor is. So, from a vendor perspective, Anton, what's your thought or experience about the anonymous proposal concept?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is the first time I've ever experienced that, and the anonymity in the RFP process. And at the beginning, when reading through it, I was a little bit taken back, I'd say, to begin with. But then obviously thinking through it, you start to realize that it's essentially protecting the integrity of the RFP process. And that's really, in my opinion, that's what it does, right? It takes away the opportunity for bias and it really just puts merits against merits. And that's really how it should be done. That's how fair RFP process works well. And from my personal experience, and maybe it's easier for me to say that because it was successful, but I think maybe from the feedback you got from those who weren't, it was really quite nice. You submitted feeling positive, like you actually had a chance because it took away some of those aspects that I mentioned earlier, which was, hey, I don't usually tender things that I don't have a relationship with. And in this case, that was the situation with this tender.
Yeah,
The situation with this tender was I didn't have a relationship and we did tender it. We did submit anyways because after we received the documentation, it was pretty obvious that we were going to have a very fair evaluation process. And that was mainly because of, I think, the anonymity in the process.
wow. Okay.
So, John, I actually went against what we usually do because usually we would not tender on projects that have been just put out like that.
That you don't have a relationship with the client or you haven't spoken to the client before about it. Wow.
Correct. Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. No, that's awesome. One of the other things that one of the benefits that we talk about, so totally agree with the fairness and transparency, but one of the benefits that we see with the anonymous proposal nature is it really improves the quality of the proposal. Because if you think about it,
Mm.
if you have a company that rely heavily on their branding, on their name, on who they are, on their relationship with the client, once you tell them that we're going to take this away from you, these vendors are now really forced to put contents of a high quality to differentiate themselves and their expertise without relying on their name, because your name is not going to serve you in that environment. So it really improves the quality of the proposal that we get from vendors. And this is one of the most commonly pain points that we see from clients is we get a lot of fluff and marketing and sales materials injected into the RFPs, and it takes us forever to go through all of that. So the anonymous part, hand in hand with the next concept that we're going to talk about, which is the limited proposal document, really work well together when you're trying to match and marry these two concepts together. So when we talk about the limited proposal on this RFP process, we're talking how many pages, Anton, was the proposal documents that you had to submit?
6, am I
Six
right?
pages. That
Yes.
was all. 6 pages for the vendors to submit their entire proposal. And one of the most common questions that we get, what size of project do you apply this on? And the answer is every size. We have applied this on a few $100,000 projects up to $1 billion projects. And the maximum page limits that we went to were 3 pages. So, Anton, talk to me about what was the first impression when you saw that 6 pages limit?
I mean, it was the fastest proposal we've ever put together, but no, it maybe this is also just me, but all of our presentations are pretty slim. I don't have a significant marketing team. There's 2 people in our marketing team. We don't have the resources, nor do we care too much for that fluff. That's not what sells our product. What sells our product is the product. We believe quite heavily, and maybe this is also from my own bias. My grandfather built Scavello on reputation, and reputation was what won him more work. And so reputation can't be put in a fluffy document. Its reputation is built on your product, it's on your service. And really, that's a significant part, I think, of why this process that you ran was so refreshing, because we were able to just let the product talk. We were able to let the submission, the raw evaluation, really speak for itself.
One of the recent comments I got from a supplier, he told me once I saw the limit pages that you put in place, that was a $150 million project. And he told me we had to make a decision to throw out most of the rubbish that we normally throw in our proposal, because there's no way we can fit that all in this limited pages. So we had to really make strategic decision about what information we're gonna put into this proposal in that limited space. And unfortunately, this maybe that's the environment that procurement have created for vendors. Vendors have been educated to respond to tenders in that manner, where to the point now clients are now complaining that we how can we read all this sea of documents in this 2 weeks or 3 weeks period of time. So that limited pages is really for a reason. There is number one is the information that we ask vendors to submit in this approach is quite different from what normally been asked from vendors to submit. Most vendors will be asked to submit information, as you mentioned, Anton, initially, that is totally irrelevant. It's not going to be part of the evaluation decision. The client might not even read them. One of the most common things is like we ask vendors to submit the organizational chart. How easy is that to evaluate an org chart between vendors?
Mm.
But we still ask for it. So I think by cutting this down to really go to the laser focused information that's going to help you see differentials between vendors' expertise, that's really where you get to that high quality proposal information from the vendor side. But moving from there, Anton, we went because that was an IT solution. So we moved into the demonstration of the actual product. So the way we did that is we received a large number of submissions. We evaluate the written proposal, and then we shortlisted to a smaller number of vendors. We invited them for a demonstration. And the way we run the demonstration is unlike maybe the traditional way where the vendor comes in and give us all the bells and whistles about the product and tell us everything we
Mhm.
want to hear about it to sell the product. The way we structured this was very targeted to specific scenarios. We sent to the vendors upfront in the RFP document, and we told them, you need to come and show us scenario one, two, three, and four. Talk to me about that from a vendor perspective.
It was definitely quite unique. Often, when we do demonstrations of the platform once we've been shortlisted, it's typically quite disorganized. There's not a contents or there's not an agenda of sorts. And so, really, because I have done so many of these, I know how to get through them. But you're trying to read the room, and it's obviously not that easy when you're sitting across the screen from potentially up to, one we've got next week is 30 people, right? So that's another thing, right? Is how many people, who's involved, how many chefs are in the kitchen, and
People, are they
and
all
and the
evaluators?
they are all stakeholders. I wouldn't say they're all evaluators, but there could be someone who's a stakeholder who may not actually be evaluating,
But he will be influencing.
but they're exactly influencing, confusing. They can often be the
Yeah.
same thing. And so, John, I'd say just the clarity again, the simplicity, the alignment of expectation, being able to be pre-prepared. That's what that gave us. That's what that gave me. I was able to walk in there, know exactly what I was going to do pretty much in the first 10 minutes, the next 10, and so on, because I knew what you guys wanted to see. I understood that what I was showing was going to be compared to the same user journey that you were seeing by another vendor.
Hmm.
And that means that, again, where, for better or worse of a phrase, it's apples for apples. I'm not able to show you this little bit of extra something because it's not really what you wanted to see. It's not what you asked for. And even if I do, even the evaluation team that you were managing, they knew what they wanted to see. And if they saw more, they, in a way, knew that was over and above. And it wasn't the bells and whistles that were in building upon the human
Hmm.
bias.
Yeah, we spent some time initially upfront in the process with the evaluation team and the stakeholders to develop these scenarios because we're being really clear with them that you're not allowed to ask for anything other than these things. Because if that vendor A showed you this feature, vendor B showed you something different, vendor C showed you something else, how on earth are you going to make like an objective decision about which tool is better if they're showing you different things? So again, it feeds back to that fairness and giving everyone the fair chance to compete on the same conditions, in on the same ground for the same thing. So that was really the intention of structuring that. Um,
I think you did it. I think you did it. I even think I remember in that first demonstration, I think I remember you trying to control the
yeah,
crowd a little bit by saying, "That's not exactly what we're here to
yeah.
see, but we can take that offline." And there was a lot of diplomacy on your end to try to maintain the approach.
Which is sometimes you have to do that because this is quite unique, quite different. People are not used to that. They are used to the other way of doing it. Just jump in, right? Ask questions, ask about stuff like that. And we're gonna come to that on the interview because that was very critical
Mm.
to control the people, not to start firing up questions differently to different suppliers.
Yeah, to keep it consistent.
Absolutely,
John, before we move forward, I have two questions for
please.
you, if that's all right. The first question is, and I'm genuinely interested in knowing the answer to this. Before the RFP went out, how much time did you spend with your customer, with our collective customer, beforehand in the lead up to that RFP going out? What was that journey? What was that time process like?
So this particular project, they have started working on this to gather the requirements about 18 months before, and then it was put on
Wow.
hold. And now, because they were moving to a different location, that came back to life because we wanted to have that in place in the new site. So from the time that was brought back up again to my attention that we wanted to proceed with that to the time we went out to market was, I would say, about 4 or 5 weeks, because most of the function and non-functional requirement have already been gathered together. We had to do a little bit of couple of workshops here and there, engage some other interested or stakeholders to refresh the requirements, but that was the time that we had spent on that before we went out to the market.
It's not much time, even if the requirements were in most of the part there to prepare an RFP and then to have it signed off and pushed out, especially by a state government entity. That's pretty quick. John,
Mm,
my second question was around the anonymity component. Of course, even on the client side, there would have been those who have never experienced that
mm.
before. How did they take that?
That is a wonderful question because most of the pushback on this idea comes internally, not from the vendor side. A lot of the people internally, especially in IT, the subject matter expert in IT, they almost swear that they know what the right solution is and what the right supplier is. So when you tell them you're gonna hide the name from you, they go crazy. No, I need to know the name because I know what the right solution is. And we had instances before where we once we revealed the names to the evaluation team after they submit their scores, guess what these evaluators want to do? They wanted to go back and change the scores. We spend a lot of time educating the internal team first about the process and the approach and really going through why we're doing this. Because it's really important for them to understand why are we doing this. We're not trying to be unkind to them or anything like that, but it's really we're helping them to protect themselves from being biased. And bias isn't always coming from bad intentions. People most likely think about bias as corruption or bad thing, but that's not always the case. People most of the time they're trying to be genuine, they're trying to protect their organization based on the previous experience. And that will cause the bias. But that previous experience doesn't always reflect the reality. So that's really where you spend most of the time educating the internal team. But of course, there were pushbacks. And the more complex, the more big the project is, the more pushback you get from the internal clients.
I can imagine that's a very interesting to have.
It is,
I'd love to be in the room for that
yeah.
one time. That would be very
I can
funny.
I can tell you this is like by far one of the hardest concepts that we're trying to push in this approach. So the process is quite flexible in some areas, but there are some aspects that we have absolutely no degree of tolerance when it comes to adjusting anything in the process. The anonymous part is one of them. If you really wanted to have high performing vendors coming to you, exactly what you mentioned, Anthony, you normally won't respond to that tender. But if you really wanted to attract high performing vendors, you really have to convince them that you're going to be fair, that their resources are not going to be wasted. And it does take more than just telling them, I'm going to be fair. All right, so let's move on to the key personnel interviews. As I mentioned before, once we shortlist from the written proposal, we interview the top two or three key personnel that will be assigned to this particular project. I don't remember, Anton, were you one of the people that we interviewed?
I wasn't important enough. No.
You were the most important man.
Uh,
So,
no, no.
talk to me about what was your team reaction to this? Were they scared? Were they concerned?
It, it was actually quite funny because I obviously it's throughout the beginning of the RFP. It was outlined from the very start, and I told Adam, my project manager, and Pranay, they were
Yeah.
both Pranay is our head of tech who were interviewed, and I said to them both, you're going to need to do interviews one by one. When one is in the room, the other one can't be. And by the way, you have to have a whiteboard behind you, which I still don't know today what the purpose of that whiteboard was.
I'll walk you through that. I'll walk you through that.
But it was, again, shocking. I think, to be fair, the descriptive word of this evening is shocking, John. You are a shocking man.
So, with that whiteboard exercise, this is maybe one of the best questions that we have, and we spend a lot of time in our research developing those questions. And we basically, if we do this on in person or virtually, we basically get them to stand on a whiteboard, the individual, and ask them, imagine you have been awarded the project. Lay out your process for completing this project from beginning to end, identifying where the major milestones or where the major stages are, where are the major source of risks that you could see, and where do you need decisions from the client along this journey? And if you think about this, who can really respond to a question like that? If you have someone that is coming from a sales, marketing, business development background, what we've seen in our experience, they will stand up, write a few things, and then come back and sit down, and they will start to market you and sell you again. Or someone that have low expertise or have expertise but haven't thought about your project, they will struggle to give you a concise answer to this. And this is really quickly one of the high performing questions that we have in our interview style. We ask a bunch of other different questions, but this is by far is the best one. And you guys did really well on that. And one of the reasons why we interviewed them separately, most of the time you have one individual come and say something, and you have the other person say the completely different things. So you can see the level of alignment between the two individuals. And the other reason is most of the time, if you're interviewing them as a team, if you have one that's really strong and someone that's a little bit not as strong, the better person will tend to really overshadow the other guys. And you won't get a real feel about the level of expertise of that individual. So that's why we have them separately. And it takes 20 to 25 minutes per person. We have, in early days in our research, clients have been saying, no, that's not enough. We want to interview them for maybe 2 hours, 3 hours. And you can see by the 40 minutes, people start to yawn and falling asleep. You don't need that amount of time to make a decision about if that person is risky or he knows what he's talking about. And if you have the right question to ask, that becomes really easy. And that's what we have came across in our experience with this approach. And one of the common question that we ask vendors as soon as they walk into the interview, the first one we ask them, why are you here today? And most common answer that we get, I have no idea. My boss just called me last night and asked me to show up.
That's
People are
terrible.
quite honest in this environment. And can a vendor trick you on a written proposal? Maybe. They can maybe use some AI tools these days or do something. But can they really trick you when you bring them one on one and talk to them in that fashion? Oh man, it's tough. I can tell you, it's really tough to fake expertise in that environment. All right. So moving on from there, we shortlisted one vendor, which is Neurospace, and we went to the clarification phase. Do you want to give a concise description about what is a clarification phase is from your experience?
Yeah, clarification phases aren't very common, I'd say. I think if my memory can serve me well, I'd say that this RFP was the first time we'd ever experienced a clarification process. And interestingly, I think the next week we had another tender, another RFP that we actually went through our second clarification
Mm,
process. And they were chalk and cheese, very different. Our one, if you recall, do you remember how long our first clarification meeting was? It was over 2 hours, I
yeah.
think. Yeah, it was pretty much like a half day. It was a morning. And we went through a lot of information. We had a significant deck that we'd put together. We even had a pre meeting to run through that as well. If you recall, John, we had a significant amount of preparatory effort that had gone in to ensure that the clarification was a valuable time spent. On the other hand, the other RFP we did was probably about closer to 4 hours of effort put into that. And that was really because we'd just gone through it the week before with you and that state government. And then this other federal government, we actually were able to use a lot of those expertise and a lot of that we had done just the week before, which was quite timely, and put together something quite amazing. And by the way, we won that one as well.
Wonderful.
And inadvertently, we were able to lean on the process that we'd gone through in another RFP, which was really fantastic.
Yeah. I think you're referring to the kickoff meeting. So let me just unpack this a little bit.
Oh,
So the whole goal of the clarification is to really minimize any surprises or minimize the amount of surprises that could happen after we sign the contract. So The first thing that we do in the clarification phase, I think we spared about 2 or 3 weeks for the clarification phase to happen. And in there, we have really a number of targeted meetings with the execution team from the vendor, with different parts of the key stakeholders, some of from the PNC, some from the IT, some from security, just to make sure that all the alignment is in place. And we don't want anyone to be surprised after we sign the contract. And the goal was to really pre plan the project delivery during this period. So on day one, there's no let's have a discovery call to see how this project's going to be unfold. On day one, everyone knows what they're going to be doing. And we've all agreed on that. And one of the concepts behind the clarification period, if you think about the majority of the RFP process, throughout the process, you're dealing with the business development, the sales, the marketing people, and you barely see the people that will do the work. Once you sign the contract, this team will disappear from the vendor and the execution team will come in and they will start to work with you on how they're going to develop the execution and the delivery of this project or service. And this is where, in our experience, the majority of the problems comes in because these people, they haven't been talking to you at all before and you haven't seen them before. You don't know what their level of understanding is. One of the funny comments that we get with the interviews, we ask people what is the biggest challenge do you see in this project, and my favorite one is people will tell us my biggest challenge is to do everything our sales and marketing people promise that we can do.
It's terrible.
I love this one,
God,
it's my favorite. So
that
in the
is.
clarification phase, the first thing we have is a kickoff meeting, and really the goal of the kickoff meeting to have two decisions. One, are there any deal breakers that prevents us from moving forward the discussion with this vendor? We want to know that upfront. We don't want to spend weeks on pre-planning to find out that major things has been missed. The number thing is to put together a schedule that we agree with the vendor and the client on how the vendor as the expert want to use the remainder part of this clarification period. The vendor will decide who they want to meet with, what meetings they wanted to have in place, what documents or access or things they want to see during this period to put a solid plan to us. And we had that initial meeting and went fantastic. And we went through the different targeted meetings with different people. People came up with tons of challenges. And most of the time, the concerns or the risks in the client mind for the vendor, they aren't even risks. They can deal with that very easily. But if you haven't give them the appropriate channel to voice this out, these are like the muted voice in their head. And that's what affects their decision when they are evaluating. So we tell the evaluators when evaluating the tender part, the written proposal, if you have any concerns about, even if you know that what this supplier is saying is, if he's lying or that's not possible, keep that to yourself for now. Give them the score on the information you have, knowing once that vendor gets to the clarification, we're going to verify everything.
Mhm.
And up until the clarification period is done, we haven't signed the contract. So if either party is not happy, we can extract from the process without penalty. So that was really the experience on the clarification phase. And I think in major projects, what we see, Anton, is it reduces the amount of change orders and contract variations by up to 60% on highly complex projects because a lot of the plans have been put in place upfront with the vendor.
Yeah, and I can see the value in it. It made the process for us all the way through to going live, which John I think was 3 weeks ago. I think for that customer, 2 to 3 weeks ago, maybe. It was smooth. We didn't hear a thing. We haven't heard a thing. We're in touch with them, of course, for the early hypercare period as well, but it hasn't had a hiccup, which has been fantastic. And I think that's testament to the process, but then also on the client side, having a good team, having the right people there, having that selection and that commitment to bringing on board the right vendor and then launching.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts you have, Anton, on generally on this process, or on the other, if you would give like a word of advice to the procurement
Mm.
people.
My God, my word of advice would be call John. That would be my word of advice. And just hearing earlier, John, about how your counterparts in the US, they're building momentum. There was talk of potentially Google interested in the process, and they had an outreach to better understand the process and maybe even implement it themselves. I cannot see why, if you had your organization's best intentions at top of mind, why you wouldn't want to be experiencing and going through the process that has been outlined by yourself in this case. It is by far, from my experience, the best tender process we've ever been through. And unless we work together again on future RFPs, I don't really see that being topped anytime soon, because unfortunately, in Australia, maybe this is a whole other conversation in itself. I'm not sure if Australia's fully aware of the current situation when it comes to RFPs. I'm not sure if there is enough light on, I don't want to go as far as to say the failure in the current status, the current overarching RFP process or procurement process, but it isn't discussed enough. And this is the first time I've ever really been a part of an RFP process that has been very well thought out, and it needs to be more broadly adopted.
Yeah. Thanks for that feedback. It's really amazing to hear the vendor side of things, because a lot of the time the clients in their mind, they are feeling that they're doing all right. Our process is is good enough, is perfect. We don't hear any complaints, we don't see anything happening. But if you really look close enough into what's your vendor saying behind your back about the process, about how fair you are, and I just posted something on LinkedIn. It doesn't matter what do you think of yourself. If you think that your process is perfect and your vendors think that no, your process is unfair, it's too much work, it's confusing, it's not adding value, what do you think of yourself? That doesn't really matter. And I think most of the problem comes from the procurement process has been there for decades and nobody touched it, because in order for you to touch it, you have to experiment with different things. And a lot of people don't have the leverage in their work, in their job, to try different things. They can't afford for something to go wrong and they bear the result. And that's why we see, I think, ourselves being lucky enough to have that research where we have experimented with this. We've implemented this approach on over 3,000 procurements over 25 years. And it's very consistent, successful outcomes that we get every single time. But it's hard for people to tell them that, because change is not really for everyone. But for people that can have that vision up front, they see the value of this and they say, I'm willing to give this a go and try how it works. So in some other organizations in Canada, for example, we worked with one of the universities there. We started with one project and now we're doing the 312 project with them. So we run over 300 projects with this approach with them. So hopefully we can build the same momentum here in Australia and New Zealand and the nearby regions. But I would like to really thank you so much, Anton, for your time. It's been invaluable to hear your side of things on the procurement world and the procurement game. You give us a lot of the insights that typically the procurement people don't hear or don't listen from the vendor side. The game is not open enough for that communication to come fairly between the two parties. And I think you've shared with us some really great insights for our audience. So thank you so much for being with us today. And I really appreciate your time.
And thank you, John. It's an absolute pleasure not only to have experienced the process that you were able to deliver in that customer instance, but of course being able to have this opportunity to share as well, and hopefully we have some impact. Hopefully this has some impact to some viewers, to some eyes, and really what we're all after, I think, is fair, integrity, and honest RFP processes. And if we can all achieve that, I think we're going to deliver better outcomes for our customers.
Wonderful. And for any of our audience, if you're looking for any disk booking system, workplace, system, I would highly recommend Neurospace. These
Eurospace.
guys are extremely professional in what they're doing. So I highly encourage you, if you're looking for something like that, reach out to them. I will make sure to put your contact details, if you don't mind, or the website at least, in the show notes.